Good morning, everyone. The webinar is about to start, and so we want to thank everyone for attending another one of our monthly webinar series. And this series, as in the past, is jointly organized by the IU ASEAN Gateway Office and the School of Education's Global and International Engagement Unit here in the School of Education. Today, we are very honored and very fortunate to have Lee Ching Ho, a professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Keith Barton, professor at Indiana University. They'll be engaging us in a discussion of curriculum for justice and harmony, their most recent book in the year of 2022. Because this webinar series also aims to bring international scholars together, I would also would like to share that Professor Ho is from Singapore originally, and Professor Keith Barton is from Kentucky. The webinar will take the form of a 30-minute conversation between our guest speakers. We will then proceed with a 20-minute Q&A questions. Audience members, you can post your questions anytime during this conversation, and at the end of 30 minutes, we'll pull them out and engage our speakers with your questions. So feel free to post your questions anytime. So Professors Ho and Barton, we welcome you both. Your discussion cannot come at a more timely moment at this point in time. Please proceed and take it away.
All right, thanks very much. I'm going to begin, and then Dr. Ho will take over in a moment, although we both may be contributing throughout. I'll start by sharing our PowerPoint. So as Frida mentioned, this is our conversation today is based on some of the ideas in our recent book, Curriculum for Justice and Harmony: Deliberation, Knowledge, and Action in Social and Civic Education. It's based on ideas that we tossed around for several years and began working on very seriously just a few years ago. And we were fortunate enough to actually get it all finished and done and out. So it was published last year. I know some of you have had a chance to look at that already. The book, I guess, takes as its basis the fact that there are a lot of problems in the world today. That's not going to come as a surprise to anybody. Problems of warfare and conflict, environmental problems, including climate change, obviously refugees, things like housing insecurity or police brutality. I mean, it doesn't take long to come up with a list of really pressing social problems in the world today. And in schools, we expect schools to, in some ways, help students learn to deal with these things and learn how to make decisions about how to lead to a better world. But both Dr. Ho and I have worked in school systems around the world. We're familiar with the curriculum of schools in many different places. And our basic feeling is that the school curriculum in areas related to social and civic education is really not up to the task. I mean, when you think about what the curriculum actually looks like in most countries, it's kind of like this. That is, it's just a jumble of diverse and oftentimes conflicting content that doesn't really go anywhere in particular. There's a little bit of patriotic nationalism and a little bit of multiculturalism, a little bit of social justice, a little bit of traditional content, things that have just always been taught, some disciplinary content, and it doesn't really cohere together in a way that would help students address the pressing problems in the world today. And so that's really our core idea, is how could the curriculum of social and civic education better enable students to meet all these challenges we face today. And at its most basic level, the book is framed around this question, which comes from Walter Parker. How can we live together justly in a diverse world? So all of the ideas in it come from this premise that we should be teaching students to make decisions about how to live together justly. And there's really two different parts to that, obviously. There's the living together part and the justice part. A lot of the book is focused on the issue of justice. And I actually think we have a very compelling and somewhat unique approach to the issue of justice in the school curriculum. It's just not the part we're going to talk about today because we can't cover everything. Instead, we're going to start by talking about the other part of this, the living together part. And we phrase that in terms of harmony. Now, when Dr. Ho and I first started working together several years ago, she kept hinting at the idea that harmony should be a part of the curriculum. And it took her a long time to convince me of this. She pointed out that in most parts of Asia, it's just taken for granted that part of what you're preparing students to do is to live in harmony with others. And yet, that's really not very much of the tradition in the West. Of course, we do focus a lot on justice, but not so much on harmony. And I was very skeptical. As a good Westerner, I was very skeptical of this idea. And in fact, in one of the early iterations of our work, we shared it with a very thoughtful colleague of ours here at IU. And his response was, what's all this harmony stuff? Harmony doesn't mean anything. And so it's really taken, especially for me, a lot of work to figure out what is harmony and why is it important? At its core, the idea of harmony is about balancing and strengthening social relationship, nurturing the bonds that hold us all together, not ignoring those, not pretending they're not there, but really taking them seriously as part of the curriculum. And I think that what that means at the core is understanding and caring about the many different ways that people are connected to each other and to the environment. Sometimes in very positive ways, sometimes in less positive ways, but we're all connected to each other. There's no way in which we can pretend that we're isolated either from people nearby or people far away or from the environment. And I think one of the things that we need to emphasize is that caring about these social relationships requires mutual accommodation and adjustment. And the first photograph there, a crowded street in, I think it's in Singapore, somewhere in either East or Southeast Asia, has always been my image of what this kind of mutual accommodation means. Because I'm always struck by the fact that when I'm in Asia, in very, very crowded streets, people can walk past each other without bumping into each other. There just seems to be something that's taken for granted about how to move through the world without blocking other people. Of course, we have crowded cities in North America or Europe too, but we bump into each other a lot more. And so for me, that's kind of an image of what mutual accommodation is all about. But then in other times, it involves much more serious things than just walking down a street. Sometimes giving up some of our own material resources or our own time or energy for the benefit of others, or perhaps foregoing certain uses of the environment in order to keep the environment healthy. And a key point here is that when we're talking about harmony, we don't just mean being kind to your neighbors. We're talking about having students think about what sorts of laws or policies or societal practices would advance harmony and how to bring those about. So it's not character education. It's thinking about at a societal level, how do we nurture relationships? Now, part of my initial resistance to the idea of harmony is that it immediately calls forth for me, and I think for many Westerners, the idea of conformity and uniformity. And even in much of Asia, it can be used that way. And so we added the word critical to it. When we talk about harmony, we're talking about a view of harmony that has a more critical perspective. And that would mean, for example, embracing conflict and tension. I mean, the way towards a more harmonious world is not by suppressing differences of opinion, but embracing. Also, a key point is that critical harmony means working against power imbalances. Because harmony is all about balance, but that means that we can't go on allowing those with more power, economic or political or societal, to rule the world. So, for example, if you're dealing with an issue such as opioid abuse, which is a huge problem in the United States, these decisions can't just be made by pharmaceutical companies or lobbyists or politicians. They have to incorporate the perspectives of people in local communities that are affected by this. So seeking varied perspectives is an important part of critical harmony. And related to that, critical harmony values difference and diversity. It's not uniformity by any means, but even in radical forms. So, I mean, we're all familiar with metaphors like, using different forms of spice to make a better meal. But sometimes this can be interpreted in, a very neutral sort of way. But a big part of our book is talking about how if we're including voices from the margins, if we're including the voices of people who challenge societal expectations, that in the long run, that's going to lead to a more integrated whole, because we all have things to learn from each other, even when that's not obvious at first. So a big part of the book is about critical harmony. Another part, which Dr. Ho is going to take over talking about now, relates to how to get students to care about these kinds of issues. So I've stopped sharing, and I think now she's going to pick up from there.
All right. Thank you, Keith. So as Keith said earlier, we really wrestled with the concept of harmony, and even myself, I mean, I grew up in Singapore, and the concept of harmony was thrown about every day, but in many other settings, there were various interpretations. Some were a little bit more problematic than others, as well as some other concepts within as well. So those were the struggles that we came up with. But in the end, we think that it's still a very valuable part of thinking about education apart from justice. So for this part, we'd like to talk a little bit more about the idea of caring. Right. And I'm sure as teachers, all of us have been familiar with remarks made by our students where they'll say, then why should I care about this? It doesn't affect me, so why should I bother? It's not my concern. Or, the typical classic student response, like, who cares? Right? So that's a huge challenge that we as social and civic educators face. The problem of youth apathy, detachment, and dispassion. So the question is, what can we as teachers do in order to try to address this lack of concern on the part of young people, especially for important social issues? So one big part of the book, in fact, it's an entire chapter, is focused on how do we as teachers help young people extend their compassion, their feelings of compassion to others, to distant others. So again, why should it matter, right? I mean, for us as teachers to pay explicit attention to helping students extend their feelings of compassion. So for students to take informed, deliberative action, for students to learn about very difficult social issues, this requires motivation. Students need to care enough about an issue to discuss it carefully and take appropriate social action. The philosopher Richard Rorty posed this really important question. Why should I care about a stranger, a person who is no kin to me, a person whose habits I find disgusting? And his response is essentially to get to put yourself in that person's shoes, to try to understand what this person is going through in all its complexities. So for this idea of extending compassion, we draw on a Confucian philosopher called Mencius, who lived about 2,000 years ago. And he argued that all of us have innate senses of empathy and compassion, right? But these are limited, very constrained, and he called them sprouts. The point of his argument is that we need to nurture these sprouts and to cultivate them so that we can extend our very limited innate understandings of feelings of empathy and compassion to others, to distant others. So the distance could mean people who live far away. So in other words, they're geographically distant, or they could be distant socially. So people whose lives are very different from that of ours. Also, we argue that it's important to pay attention to compassion in our education system is because people are more motivated by compassion, those feelings of compassion, as opposed to just reason alone. So what can teachers do? One suggestion that we have is to help students learn about the concrete circumstances and experiences of others. So in other words, we are not talking about, let's say, presenting charts and graphs or news stories that talk about large groups in abstract. So for example, if you just refer to refugees in the abstract, it's really hard for students to have that sense of compassion for people who are undergoing such hardship. What would really matter would be actually focusing and learning about the concrete circumstances. That means what makes them, what are they going through that brings them joy, but also that brings them suffering, right? So I'm just going to show a short little video clip that I think perhaps highlights how one can possibly approach the complicated issue of teaching students about climate change and the people affected by sea level rise as a result of climate change. So climate change can be a very distant issue, not only for my students here in the Midwest, but also back when I was in Singapore and as a teacher there as well. So it's really hard for young people to imagine what people are going through. And it's kind of like an abstract, distant concept. So this video, I'll just play it as a short video.
Sa kunan katukat sila pupus.
Ako wadi jaran pa mon miaka daw miaka tandak jadi main di nano di tinu aja teh oman daus ada apa tarik kan oman daus ya apa ada bentar pakai pakai kawayan kalau kerja agak jaga kawayan jangan kadang-kadang kalau corona jangan ada kayak gimana orang
Kaya kumustar. Tapayari ito katino yon tepon ay taydikin ang ngapongin sus ari toni pe tangiya pa ati kaya kaya pusintar nakon tayo kanaro ngasiyan.
So this really short clip actually shows the experiences that the residents of Kiribati, an island in the middle of the Pacific, are experiencing. So they've lost their homes, they've lost some of their farm animals, young children are directly affected by this. And videos like this, stories, words, and images convey experiences and feelings in, as you can see, very emotionally compelling ways. So, in essence, what we suggest is that teachers pay explicit attention to helping young people extend their feelings of compassion to distant others, to help them move beyond their immediate self-interest, to help them care about these people who are experiencing hardships in different parts of the world. And we hope it will motivate them to take action to meet the needs of others. So for the last part of this talk, Keith and I will be talking a little bit about a concrete strategy that we can implement in the classroom, and we call it collaborative deliberation. Keith?
All right, so for this part, for the next few slides, I'll be talking and Dr. Ho will be moving the slides. So this will be a real test of whether harmony can actually exist in practice. So the book is really takes for granted that students should be deliberating social issues. So it's not about how to fill them with information. It's not about how to tell them what they should do, but rather it's about how they can engage with knowledge so that they're making decisions about the best way to address social issues. And so as you'll see on the next slide, I mean, this is premised on the idea of deliberation as a basis for decision-making, people working together to decide what should we do. Deliberation has become a very common practice, at least a very common recommended practice in social and civic education over, say, maybe the last 30 or 40 years. It's almost the dominant model for what students should be doing. But as we were working on the ideas in this book, we became dissatisfied with the way in which it's usually presented. What we call the dominant model of deliberation is all about framing topics around conflict. Should we do this or should we do that? Or should we do this thing or not do this thing? One example is the very common approach of structured academic controversies, where students consider the arguments for and against a particular issue and then take a position. There are many different curriculum approaches that take this perspective as deliberation being about conflict between competing alternatives. But that's really not how the world works. I mean, of course, there's competition between competing perspectives, but much more common, most of what we do in our daily life doesn't involve arguing with people who disagree with us. Most deliberation in the real world involves discussion among people who have the same goals and values and who are trying to decide how best to achieve those. For example, if I'm working together with colleagues here at the university and we're trying to design some curriculum program, it's not like one of us wants what's best for students and one wants what's worst for students. I mean, we have the same goal of improving our program, and we're trying to figure out how to do that. And this happens throughout people's lives. And so we decided to come up with a different model of deliberation that focuses on collaboration.
All right, so to build on what Dr. Barton has just said, just to introduce another example, members of a nature society, for example, all care about protecting the environment. So they're not debating about should we or should we not protect the environment. But what they are interested in is figuring out ways in which they could protect the environment. So, and deliberations within such organizations or such settings would be collaborative in nature. So this is how we define collaborative deliberation: non-adversarial problem solving within a trusting, mutually reciprocal partnership premised on common interests and involving diverse forms of expression and communication. So this is a mouthful, I know, but we will tease out the parts of this, and we argue that we need to explicitly prepare young people to learn how to engage in collaborative deliberation, in addition to the more traditional forms of deliberation that already exist. So what is this collaborative deliberation model? Here we have one first step that we can take in order for the teacher to set up collaborative deliberation, and I've also provided examples. So the first thing that we need to do as teachers is to think about how we want to frame the societal problem and do it in such a way that students engage in open-ended consideration of the issue. So like before, it's not should we do X or Y, or should we do X or not, right? So rather than asking, should the state provide universal childcare, we could frame the issue in terms of how can working families have greater access to childcare. Rather than thinking about framing the issue as should hate speech be permitted, we could reframe the whole thing such that students can explore the idea of protecting the safety of a vulnerable group. So the question here that would frame the discussion or the deliberation would be, how can vulnerable groups be protected against verbal attacks? So the key thing here is to frame the issue in an open-ended way. Now, the traditional forms of deliberation also privilege particular forms of communication. In other words, students are supposed to express their ideas in very rational, dispassionate, unemotional manner. However, many of these social issues are very emotional in their nature, right? And we also want students to be able to express themselves in ways that are perhaps more comfortable to them and that are more aligned to their own cultural beliefs. So the second aspect of collaborative deliberation is to encourage and teach diverse forms of expression. So we want to make space for expressions of emotion and passion. We want to introduce a range of communicative norms to students. We want to talk about when different forms of expression are most effective and appropriate, and how should they respond to it. The final aspect of collaborative deliberation that we'll talk about here right now is to get students to collectively work through the issue in an that's framed in an open-ended way, but also to justify solutions and weigh alternatives. So they need to collaboratively decide what outcomes do we want, which strategies will be most effective, what evidence do we have to support the conclusion, which organizations and individuals should we work with, and why. So this is just a very quick overview of the collaborative deliberation model that we are offering as an alternative, as a supplement to existing models of deliberation. And this table summarizes what we call traditional adversarial forms of deliberation versus collaborative deliberation. If you're interested, we can put a link to an article that we've written that's for teachers that focuses on collaborative deliberation. So with this, we'd like to stop here. Again, feel free to reach out to us at our various institutions to pose questions even after this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ho and Dr. Barton. So it is time now for the Q&A session from audience members. Audience members, post your questions anytime, and we would, forward them to our guest speakers. There've already been questions that have been coming in through multiple devices, and those who've read the articles that you posted. And so one of them actually is based on the article that you posted, which is curriculum is not able to instill compassion or benevolence. It's not capable. Now, as curriculum specialists, how do you respond to that?
You or me?
You can go ahead. I just finished speaking.
You know, Dr. Hyatt has a strategy where she lets me start talking so she can actually think of a good response, which she can always come in with afterwards. Curriculum, we actually agree, curriculum cannot instill these things. And fortunately, there's a ton of research as well as 3,000 years of philosophy showing that curriculum doesn't have to instill compassion or benevolence. These are things that are natural to people. However, they're limited in scope. People feel the most compassionate towards the people who are closest to them. The task of curriculum, as Dr. Ho talked about, is to extend it, to help people see other people, other places, other events that they may not already be as familiar with. And that by coming to understand the concrete realities of other people's lives, their natural, innate sense of compassion can be extended to others. After we'd already published the book, I discovered that the most common word in it, other than the or a, is concrete. We probably overuse the word concrete, but that's one of our major points about curriculum is we have to really look at what other people's lives are like.
Dr. Ho, do you want to add to that or?
No, I think Dr. Barton has captured it has described it very clearly. So here we argue that the educational project is to help students extend their emotions. As Dr. Barton has pointed out, start off as being very limited. We naturally care about our own family. We naturally care about our own community, people who are like us. But the challenge is to help students extend these senses of compassion to others who are different from us, who live far away, who are strangers, right? So that is what we argue is the education project that teachers should explicitly attend to. So many teachers actually do it. They try to do it in many settings, right? But we argue that we need to pay specific attention to that in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. I think along those lines, Karina has posted a question. Is there a way for teachers to determine the success of the implementation/execution of the collaborative deliberation model, which is central to what you were just saying, Dr. Ho?
Your turn to start.
So, that's a very good question. So there have been studies in the past that have examined the impact of other deliberation models on students' learning, as well as students' senses of tolerance for others and ability to communicate alternative perspectives and viewpoints that are not theirs. So there's been a whole bunch of research that looked at the efficacy of structured academic deliberation, for example. Pat Avery from the University of Minnesota and her colleagues have investigated that. And they've actually found that deliberation models like the structured academic controversy model actually has helped students learn about different perspectives, help them express different perspectives, as well as increase their tolerance for others. So I imagine that something similar, a similar project, a similar research project could be applied to this collaborative deliberation model. This model is actually very new. We are still we are trying to get teachers interested in trying this model out in their classroom, and we would love to study it. I think some of the measures that we might use to determine success would be students' ability to understand multiple perspectives, students' abilities to jointly evaluate different possible policy solutions or alternatives to a question. And I think because we see this deliberation as a key element in terms of helping young people take informed action, I think that looking at their ability to work together to actually implement some of these real world problems, solutions to problems, will also be a good yardstick.
Mhm.
Dr. Barton, do you want to say anything?
I have about 15 to 20 more minutes to say about that, but I think I'll just let that answer stand in the interest of more questions.
Mhm. There's another question that has just come in, and I'll bring together Alvin's question with another question that just came in from on a different device. And that question is the difference between compassion and benevolence. That's one part. And then Alvin's question is, how can we nurture this sense of benevolence in a classroom of diverse learners who may have a very different sprouts of compassion? Dr. Barton?
So we certainly wrestled with definitions of things like empathy and compassion and benevolence. And the distinctions we wound up settling on, and of course, different people can define these in different ways, but just for our own conceptual clarity, compassion is caring about others. Benevolence is doing something about it. So when you're giving up your time or your resources, that's benevolence. And, you know, some people may care about somebody, but not do anything about it. So to us, it's kind of a sequence. You have to care in order to act benevolently. And the second part of the question was about, oh yeah, when students are diverse. One of the things we do mention in the book, perhaps not as much length as we might, is throughout the book, we've tried to identify guidelines and principles that teachers can use flexibly in different circumstances. And so one of the things is teachers will certainly have to be aware of what their own students do and do not already care about or need to know about. So some students may already understand certain other people very deeply, whereas others do not. And I think teachers just have to be responsive to that and think about, what do my particular students need to do and how can I help them do that? Li Ching? Particularly diversity part, maybe?
I think that students have multiple identities. At some point in time, they are more salient, at others they are not, right? So for example, if one thinks about that 8-year-old girl living on the Pacific island of Kiribati, right? She and her life on that island is very distant to any group of students, diverse group of students within a particular classroom setting, perhaps in Singapore or in the US or in any other country, right? So in that case, all these students, even though they have different sprouts of compassion, they also still need to be taught how to extend that compassion to the distant life of that 8-year-old girl living on the island Kiribati. So in that setting, you know, they have this shared basis for learning. So that's something that we might want to think about when we try to make our education more global, and we try to bring in these ideas that affect distant others.
Okay, I mean, I'm sure there's lots more to converse about, you know, diversity in the classroom and how to engage in nurturing that as per the question that was asked. I think the next thread of questions, by the way, this in response to Trump's question, yes, we will, this is available, it is being recorded and it will be available to all those who've attended. And the other, there are two questions related, I think. One is from Gulbahar, which is the role of language in promoting compassion and harmony. And I think the other is, the thought about the question about vocabulary to present their perspectives in terms of, in bringing the idea of critical harmony into the classroom. So both questions are related to language to be used. Keith or Dr. Barton or Dr. Ho?
You want to start or do you want me to?
I can start with Mohana's question first. So yes, Mohana, I think that you are absolutely right in terms of equipping students with the necessary kind of like vocabulary. First, I think it's really important when we are introducing concepts like harmony or even justice, is not to take for granted that everybody has a shared understanding of what it means. I think it's crucial to help students learn how to critically interrogate what does harmony mean? What are the different dimensions of harmony? How are there different perspectives of harmony? And understanding how that concept has been applied in many different settings in various ways, it's a crucial first step. So my larger point here is not take for granted what these definitions, what these concepts mean, but actually help students interrogate, investigate, engage deeply and critically with these concepts and think about what are their affordances and limitations. Keith?
All right, so Gubahar's version of this question is about the role of language in promoting these ideas. And of course, Gubahar Beckett's a linguist, so of course she asked a question about language. And it seems like to me it could have there could be many different ways of interpreting it. It could be about terminology being used, or it could be about types of language, or it could be about understanding other languages. For the terminology one, I think that's incredibly important, because we have to help students think about the ways in which the terms used for people or circumstances influence our thinking about it. So right now, Dr. Ha and I are working on some curriculum related to homelessness. And one of the things that we are constantly thinking about is, when do we use the word homeless? When do we use the word housing insecurity? When do we talk about people experiencing housing insecurity, or people who are unhoused? As teachers, we have to be aware of those distinctions, but it's also helpful, I think, to include students in those conversations and to have students think very carefully about what meaning different words has and how that casts different people in different ways. And part of that is understanding how different terms are used differently in different countries, so that a term that might strike an American as derogatory sometimes is used as a word of pride, or at least just pure description without evaluation in other parts of the world. So helping students understand that, I think, is important. But another aspect of that is particularly important in the collaborative deliberation part is helping students think about what forms of language are useful in developing emotional appeals, but what are the pros and cons? And what other forms of language are useful in coming up with a reasoned argument about what to do using statistics and evidence and so on? And what are the pros and cons of that? So helping students understand the different kinds of language use, I think, is part and parcel of this larger project.
Mm-hmm. So the next question, I think one of the things is going back to what you just said, Dr. Barton, which is the potential limitations of the collaborative deliberation model. So, and I think the second part of the question is to suggest how the model can be applied in some societies where authoritarianism is an obstacle.
Mm-hmm. You want to lead with either of those parts of the question, Dr. Ho?
Why don't you do the first one and I'll do the second one? Where we're talking about authoritarian societies.
I mean, I think one of the limitations. So a limitation in practice can be that I can easily imagine this being misused by having spending 10 minutes getting students to care about something and then launching into collaborative deliberation. Students are not going to put forth the effort to engage in deliberation if there's not an extensive amount of attention devoted to actually developing compassion around a particular issue. So that's one thing. We can't just take collaborative deliberation and put it into an easily packaged box. To me, that's been one of the real drawbacks in other aspects of social education in recent years, is you take a very complicated procedure and put it in a 40-minute lesson. And it can't really work like that. So collaborative deliberation absolutely takes time. But another sort of limitation, or at least a boundary, is it cannot be used for highly divisive issues. You can't take an issue in which there are clear conflicting sides and say, okay, we're going to ignore those and turn it into a collaborative deliberation. It's about framing issues differently rather than just a Band-Aid on already existing division.
So for the second part of that question, how this model can be applied in societies that are fairly authoritarian in nature and that perhaps constrain the abilities of young people and schools to try to be activists in many different ways. So the beauty of this model is that it helps young people learn how to work together based on a shared understanding and belief about a common problem, right? So, and that model can be applied in many different settings and at many different scales. It doesn't all need to result in public political action. So as I mentioned before, in the example of that of a nature society, members of a nature society agree that it's perhaps important to protect the mangrove swamps or the other wetlands as part of their country, right? So they have the shared belief. They want to do something about it. But in that deliberation that they have with each other, they collectively can decide what is the best strategy that we can adopt to achieve our goals of protecting this mangrove swamp or these wetlands that are so essential for us as a community. So they might work together to think about different things. Then again, collaborative deliberation can also be introduced within a school setting. So we have a colleague who worked with young children in primary school, and they were trying to deliberate and figure out what is the best way in terms of spending money to design a playground for their school. Right? So these young children were figuring out like, okay, if we design a playground in this way, it will benefit this group of students, but not others. There are drawbacks for different solutions that they produce. But eventually they agreed, they coalesced on some idea and presented that idea to the Parent-Teacher Association. So again, that's an example of collaborative deliberation within the school setting. So the idea here is to give students practice in terms of working with others in mutually reciprocal ways at different scales, at different levels. So even if it's not possible for young children to take public action or political action in a setting, there are still opportunities available and spaces available, spaces of possibilities within the school setting or even within the community setting. But the important thing is to help young people learn to deliberate, make decisions jointly with others.
And I think there are only a few places, only a few countries that are so authoritarian that they don't want anybody to have any input on any issue. So getting back to Dr. Ho's point, in my particular setting, what are the areas of deliberation that are possible, rather than assuming that it's the same every place?
Mm-hmm. So there's a question that just popped up on another device, which is, and I think this will be the final question perhaps, is you mentioned the importance of knowledge and the difference between difficult knowledge and dark fountains of knowledge. If you want to take that question on, there's also another question on emotion and incivility. How to deal with that in the curriculum in the classroom when you have collaborative deliberation? Either one or both.
The word civility means this is Dr. Ho's question.
So let's talk a little bit about the role of emotion. So the unique dimension of collaborative deliberation is that we want to encourage students to express their emotions, their feelings, as they speak, rather than just restraining, confining their emotions, and to make sure that they only speak in very dispassionate, unemotional ways. So emotion is, I think, it's a strength, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because these are powerful, very significant events, and we want students to care about them. So emotions most certainly have a place. But as teachers, we tend to worry, right, about these expressions of emotion, especially in the classroom setting. But I think it's important to communicate that yes, yeah, it's okay to feel despair, it's okay to feel frustration, it's okay to feel sadness. There's been lots of studies to show that students, when they're talking about an issue like climate change, they feel a deep sense of despair and hopelessness and frustration and sadness because of the future that they see is very bleak. And there absolutely needs to be a place in the classroom where students can express those emotions when they're discussing an issue like climate change. Keith, you want to talk about the next part?
The civility part?
Yeah.
I thought that was going to be all yours. I'll try to make this quick, but part of the book and also the core of a research project that Dr. Ho and I are just now getting started is thinking about when is civility appropriate and when is incivility appropriate. I mean, if we look at the history, any kind of historical development is considered good, usually started with some form of incivility. And so we want to find out what teachers and students think about when both civility and incivility is appropriate, instead of just assuming civility is always the solution to all problems. Our colleague Catherine Engebretson has written about how civility in classroom discussions sometimes papers over very difficult issues. It's a way of keeping important things from coming to the fore. So we want to try to complicate that a lot more.
Mm-hmm. So we have just a few minutes, and before we wind this up, I have an overall question that I want to pose to both Dr. Ho and Dr. Barton. But before I do so, I again want to thank you for the School of Education and IU ASEAN Gateway. I'm professor of in the department, as well as the academic director for the ASEAN Gateway. But before we end, the question that needs to be put forth to you both is, what is left unsaid? We have questions from the audience members on multiple devices. What is it, both of you? How could you round up the seminar by addressing things that you feel are left unsaid in this discussion?
I've got one. Do you want me to say it, Li Ching?
You go ahead.
Like with many works, we wrote the first paragraph last. But the first paragraph, I think, clarified what our whole project was. It was based on a quote from Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who said that life's most urgent and persistent question is, what are you doing for others? And we think that the curriculum should help students figure out what their answer is to that question. What are they doing for others? Not just in their immediate lives, but it includes that, but later on and in broader context. And I feel like if the curriculum is not preparing them to answer the question of what they're doing for others, we've failed them.
I have no idea how to top that. Perhaps one thing that as we mentioned right at the beginning, our book is about justice and harmony, right? So we focus a lot about harmony here, and we haven't really had much time to talk about justice, as well as the relationship between justice and harmony? And those are the important questions I think teachers need to wrestle with. And we argue that you need both. You need to address both issues of justice and harmony in social and civic education curriculum in order to address what Keith has just raised in terms of the goal of helping students think about what they want to do for others and to learn to live together justly in a diverse world.
Well, we have a few questions that have just come up in the meantime, but is there something else that you want to bring, including, possible topics to introduce in the classroom? If there's no time, that's fine. But if there's any last words that you want to share before we end this session, we have very few minutes, but the time is yours to do as you please.
I mean, we encourage people to get in touch with us. I mean, we know some of the participants and not others, but you're all very welcome to contact us and to ask any further questions.
We are also working on developing curriculum that teachers can use in the classroom. And once it's done, we hope that teachers might take up the call and to try out some aspects of this curriculum in their classrooms around the world.
Well, with that, again, as we said at the very beginning of this session, this is a very timely discussion. It is recorded and the links will be sent to all who've attended the session. Thank you, Dr. Ho, and thank you, Dr. Barton.
Thanks.
Continue this discussion in the next webinar series next month. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.